Welcome to my review of Gunner's Heaven for the PlayStation. This was also released as Rapid Reload in Europe. And I like this character. When I played, I liked Ruka. There's two characters you can choose from, and both of them have completely different weapon loadouts from what I remember. So I believe you have 4 different weapons, and depending on which character you choose, you'll get 4 different weapons. So it's something to keep in mind. You may want to play around and experiment and see which character you like best. But on to the review of the game. This game really tries to be like Gunstar Heroes. You know, it really took a lot from Gunstar Heroes, from the health system with the numbers, to frequent boss fights and everything in between. You have throws that are very similar to Gunstar Heroes. So it really tries to be like that, but it actually ends up playing quite differently than Gunstar Heroes. So it feels quite a bit different. If you're not familiar with that game, definitely one of the best games on the Genesis. Great action game. This game is kind of like a much lesser, version of that. But it has its own unique style and feel to it. Even though it tries to imitate Gunstar Heroes, it ends up being its own unique game. But yeah, I thought the game was, quite well executed, but it can be a little sloppy feeling at times where you kind of feel like you just take hits and bust through. But that may just be my interpretation of it. Of course, you can always learn these kind of games and beat them without damage and all that kind of shit. But some games just feel more, I don't know, they're just, not necessarily easier, they're just more readable. And, they make more logical sense initially on how to dodge a lot of stuff. But in this game, there's a lot of shit that it's really not clear to me how to dodge a lot of times. Which you may think is a good thing. It depends on how you look at it, I guess. But to me, the game felt a little sloppier. I'd say a lot sloppier than like Gunstar Heroes. But I still thought it was quite good. I didn't think it was a great game, you know what I mean? But I thought the game was quite good. It's a solid, good action game that I don't see mentioned. Very rarely. I've seen it mentioned a few times. The bosses mostly all have multi-phase. Like as you see here, there's multiple forms to most of the bosses. You defeat one form and it turns into something else and the patterns change. There's a lot of that in this game. There's no recycled bosses that I remember, so you don't have any of that, boss rush shit where they recycle all the bosses at the end. Each boss is unique. I beat this one maybe 2 or 3 years ago, so it's not as fresh in my mind, but I thought it would be a good one to review because this is a good game that I don't really see mentioned too much. It does mix up the gameplay, too. You have stages where you're riding in a cart, similar to Gunstar Heroes, where you have to shoot things while riding the cart. And there's a shooter-type level. There's at least one of those where it's like a spaceship shooter style where you're flying. The stages themselves are where the game probably suffers the most, where the stages, it just kind of feels like a mess at times, as you can see. It just feels like a lot of shit just thrown about everywhere. I mean, that was my impression anyway. So, I think the stage design was probably the weakest aspect of the game, but it's serviceable, you know what I mean? You do get used to it. But I thought that could have been a lot better, a lot smoother. The strongest part of this game for me was the boss fights. I thought some of the boss fights were pretty really, nicely done with how you had to dodge them, and you really had to learn the patterns, and the bosses were quite good. And then, they can feel a little cheap initially, but they're all well designed. I can't really say they're cheap. It's just patterns. You can learn how to dodge everything. It's not, it can be kind of a hard game at times. It's not always clear how to dodge patterns, but everything seems pretty learnable, reasonably. The final boss took me about 3.5 hours to beat, so that was the hardest part of the game. When I got to the final boss, I stopped playing for a while, took a break, and when I went back to it, I was pretty much committed to finishing off the game since it was in my backlog. So I'm probably going to show the entire boss fight at the end, the final boss fight. But see, these are how boss fights generally go. You fight these large bosses. There's smaller bosses too. That you pretty much have bosses throughout the entire game. It's a pretty frequent thing in this game. You have unlimited continues. There's no passwords or saves, though. So you have to either leave the system on, or if you're playing on an emulator like me, you just save state and then reload it. But yeah, as you can see, some of the patterns are initially pretty unclear on how to dodge, but you don't always have to be perfect. You can take hits from certain attacks sometimes and still win. So if you don't learn how to dodge everything, sometimes you'll be okay. Except for like the final boss, you really have to know how to dodge almost everything. I mean, there's a few areas where you can fuck up a little, but it's like a 4-minute fight, so you don't have a lot of room to mess up. So this is the level I was referring to as kind of a minecart level. I guess it's not. It's more of a roller skating level, but it's similar to the minecart stage in Gunstar Heroes. And as you can see, the enemies are in minecarts. So here you're just rolling constantly. You can switch planes between the top and bottom plane, and you just constantly fire and take out, the enemies. And this is actually a very cool stage. It shakes it up a little bit since, you have to keep moving because the screen's always scrolling. And then there's the shooter stage that's similar to this where you're flying and you're constantly moving as well. It's an auto-scroller. The 4 different weapons give a lot of variety because different weapons really are better for certain scenarios. Like the flamethrower kind of takes out the bullets of that tank and takes down the tank, so it's real good for that. Then you see me switching back to the homing, which is my favorite weapon in the game, the homing shot. It's great for bosses because no matter where you are on the screen, the homing shot will hit the boss. It is weaker, but as long as you can dodge the boss's patterns, that's all you really have to focus on with the homing shot. You can let the homing shot pretty much, damage the boss constantly as you just dodge shit. So that's my favorite weapon overall, but sometimes it is better to use other weapons. You're going to want to switch weapons for certain scenarios. Because the homing weapon is weak, it won't take out, when there's a lot of enemies on screen that take multiple hits, it won't really take them out. So you have to switch over to a spread shot or something else. The game does make you, it makes pretty good use of the different weapons, making you switch between them. There's one more basic shot out of the 4 weapons that I didn't find to be useful pretty much for most scenarios, but I do use it sometimes. Like you see me using it here. It's just a basic shot. It's okay for certain scenarios, but usually one of the other weapons is better. There's usually a better weapon to use. But yeah, then you have stages like this where the elevator's scrolling up, you have to dodge shit and move around. It's a little bit of a different style. There is a decent variety of stage types. And even the stages, the game can be quite challenging even during some of the stages. There's definitely some hard stages. You can take multiple hits, as you see. You have a life bar, and you also have bombs you can drop, but you don't get a lot of those. But they will damage everything on screen. They'll do decent damage to bosses. I think you can carry up to 4 of those if you collect that many. You also have a grapple, which is extremely useful. And you see me grappling up to ledges and spinning. That grapple move is extremely useful because it gives you invincibility frames when you're in that animation of grappling. You cannot take damage. So it's something I use heavily, especially on the last boss. It's pretty much necessary to dodge some of the last boss's attacks. So generally you go through these stages, and then you have like large boss encounters. There's usually mini bosses in the middle of the stages. There's a lot of bosses. But they're all pretty well done fights. Sometimes the patterns are pretty easy to learn. They're not all complicated patterns. A lot of it is simple patterns. But some of the bosses are tricky. But even with the simpler patterns, you have to be able to, switch quickly to dodge different attacks that the bosses do. So, the fights are never that easy. And there's usually several forms where the boss switches patterns or changes into something else. But I thought it would be good to show a decent chunk of some of the boss fights. The bosses are really the main highlight of the game that I thought. I mean, the stages were decent. And they can be kind of hard because it's not always clear how to move through without taking a lot of damage because there's a lot of shit always everywhere. So I felt like the stages were kind of sloppily designed. But I did enjoy the boss fights. Like I said, the game as a whole, I definitely enjoyed it overall. I played this when I was younger and I couldn't get too far. I think I got, decently far, but I remember using a stage select just to experience all the stages. So it was cool to actually, work on and beat the game more recently. A lot of the stages, it's good to move fast like you see me doing and just keep moving and just memorize the stages, what's coming up. Which is typical. A lot of, older games are like that. And I like that aspect of the game, but certain stages do feel very sloppy to me. And that could just be me, but I felt like they could have been better designed. The visuals are actually pretty good. I mean, this couldn't have been done on previous generation consoles, you know what I mean, like Genesis. It definitely has some extra graphics and effects. I mean, it's nothing mind-blowing on the PlayStation, but it's pretty good looking. It looks like a slight step above what you would see on a Genesis or Super Nintendo, but nothing that's really pushing the PlayStation. The music is pretty good. I didn't think there was any real memorable tracks or anything. I didn't find the music to be great, but I thought it was pretty good. I thought it served the gameplay well. Controls are tight. The controls really aren't an issue. Your character's sprite is a little big, the hitbox, so you do take damage easier than you would like at times. On this boss, you have to hang down on the ledge, sometimes to dodge, and other times you come back up. It's a pretty cool boss. It's a little tricky to some of the stuff is a little tricky to dodge. I'm sure there was a better way to do it. But it was a cool fight. You fight different parts of the robot's body, which is pretty cool. In this game, this is one of those games where it's really good to use save and load states on an emulator to practice parts. Isolated practice, where you just practice the boss for a while. And then, commit suicide and start the stage over and use what you learned. I use that mainly on the bosses. I would use save and load states to practice the bosses and get them down. But yeah, once you get to the final boss, I found that to be way harder than anything else in the game. So, expect that to be much, much harder than anything else in the game. And there is some hard stuff in the regular game, but the final boss is about a 4-minute fight, and it's quite difficult. There's a lot of shit to dodge. It's a lot of memorization, basically. I mean, you can totally learn it. It's just you have to practice and get used to every pattern that he throws out. And then he starts mixing and matching, various patterns. You have to dodge multiple things at the same time, so you got to get used to that. It's quite a tricky fight, but I actually use save and load states to practice separate sections of that boss, because he has like multiple phases where he changes his attack patterns. So I would practice each phase and try to, beat the phases without taking damage pretty much. And then I was able to put it together, but it was tough. But this was a cool fight, how you damage different parts of the body and eventually destroy the entire robot. Very cool. And there's a lot of cool ideas like that in the boss fights. Very well done. I think if this game had the stage design of something like Gunstar Heroes, the gameplay would have held up pretty well. I think it could have been a lot better than it is. So I would say that's the one weak aspect that stands out to me. But I do think otherwise the game plays quite well. I would have liked a smaller hitbox similar to Gunstar Heroes, but I know that, a lot of games wanted to have larger sprites and shit to show off the graphics, but it doesn't always work out as better gameplay to me. Sometimes when you make that hitbox too large, it just makes it more awkward to dodge shit. It's not really... it makes it feel clumsier to me, you know what I mean? But very learnable, but, so are the shittiest games. So, it's not always a compliment to say that a game is learnable. You can learn just about any shitty game with bad control, bad hit detection. You can learn them if you want to spend 40 hours on the game. It's just... it comes down to, does it feel good to learn? Do you want to keep playing because the gameplay is tight, or do you just force yourself to play because you just want to get it on a list, beat another game? So, difficulty. I love brutal games, but I don't like sloppy design. That's the thing that I would deduct points from if I'm reviewing a game. Sloppy design. Now I'm not saying that this game plays like shit, but I'm just giving an extreme example. I think this game plays quite good. I think the hitbox could be a little smaller, but the control is very tight. I don't really have any complaints about the control. And this is the shooter stage. I think this might be the only shooter stage in the game. Straight out shooter. Like a space shooter like R-Type, Gradius. But luckily it's not like Gradius where you have to get speed up power-ups. That's a fucking pain in the ass. But yeah, this level is pretty cool. The stages itself are pretty well designed. But like I said, a large hitbox in a shooter doesn't play great. So it's okay. I think it's cool that they mixed it up. But the weakest aspect of this stage and the biggest annoyance was that there's these bosses where it doesn't make sense how to even dodge them because your hitbox is so big. So I never even figured out how to dodge the bosses. But what I did figure out how to do is a very cheap technique with safe spots. I found these safe spots. And I think I found them from watching a video. But I thought that was kind of badly designed. I shouldn't have to do that on a boss, But some of this shit didn't make any sense. Like, I can dodge all this, but you'll see a little bit later it gets kind of weird. And I was, it just felt sloppy to me. Like, how the fuck are you supposed to dodge it a little bit later on? Like, this is easy enough to dodge, but... I mean, not really easy, but, you know what I mean? It's logical enough to dodge, I think. But then after you get to this part, it starts getting ridiculous. There's this shit everywhere, and I didn't know how to dodge shit. I felt like I just had to pull bullshit. Which to me is bad boss design, you know what I mean? Like, I shouldn't have to do shit like that. I think I had trouble dodging those orbs. I wasn't sure what the fuck I was supposed to do to dodge those. I'm sure there's a way to do it. But I found this safe spot here, and I exploited that. So when you get to these bosses, use that and make it a lot easier. Also, I have a full tutorial on this game with commentary, so check that out. I'll link that in the description, and that'll explain, the strategies I used. I didn't have this game down really well or anything, but I had, good enough strategies to beat everything, and I found some exploits that I think you'll find useful. But yeah, you can pretty much skip that whole phase by doing that. Very easy. Then there's another safe spot right here. It's not really safe, but I found it a lot easier to dodge all the way in the back of this. Yeah, I mean, I guess this isn't a safe spot, but the main safe spot was the one I just showed, but it's safe from that beam. See that beam? That comes out and takes up most of the screen. If you're back here, you won't get hit by that huge beam, so that's helpful. But yeah, I ended up taking a lot of damage. I mean, some of this shit I found like it was pretty damn hard to dodge, like I'm showing. I'm sure I could have done better. But I don't know, some of it just felt like it wasn't really clear how to dodge, you know what I mean? It felt like a mess to me personally. That could just be me, that I didn't practice enough to learn it. But it wasn't coming to me when I was playing the game. It just wasn't coming to me naturally on how to dodge it. And it's not like I'm new to these kind of games or anything, so I felt like it was more of a design flaw. So this is the final boss, and this one took me about 3.5 hours to beat. And as I said, it's the hardest part of the game by far. So when you get here, expect to have to practice a lot before you'll complete the game. And here I show the full final boss fight. So if you don't like spoilers, here you go. Here's a nice one. So yeah, it's very specific how you have to fight on this final boss. And I don't even remember the strategies that I used exactly, so you'd want to see my tutorial for that. Because I did the tutorial when the final boss was fresh in my mind, so I had all the information. But this is a few years ago now. It's a very cool fight, though, very, very cool. At first, it honestly felt like, how the fuck do I dodge all this shit? It was one of those fights where it wasn't logical to me initially at all, and I just had to keep practicing and practicing each phase. And after several hours, it started to come to me, and it clicked, but it's one of those things where initially it just felt very difficult to dodge anything. I was getting hit by everything. So maybe that's the case with the shooter stages. Maybe I just needed more practice on those bosses too, but I still felt like it just felt sloppy to me. I don't know. It was just one of those things. Maybe I was expecting it to feel more like a traditional shooter or different previous games that I played, you know what I mean? But I felt like some aspects of the game did feel very sloppy, so that does take away from the game for me. But yeah, this was a very cool fight. This was a satisfying fight to get down in the end. And the game was very satisfying to beat, which is always... see, I use the grapple move, which you don't see me use much in the game, but you'll see me use it here. See, when I grapple up and spin, that dodges those pink bullets. It's the only way to dodge those pink bullets. You have to use your invincibility frames to dodge those. Whenever you use that grappling hook, you get those invincibility frames, so you don't take any damage while you're in that animation. So you got to utilize that to dodge some things. I think that was the only time that I really used that to dodge bullets. Probably, if I had thought of that earlier, it might have made some other boss fights easier. If they had areas to grapple to, I'm not sure. I know I didn't really end up using that move much until the final boss. So I may have not been aware of how useful it was until this point in the game. I'm not sure. But yeah, you can see there's many phases to this fight. It's a very cool fight. I like that there's a lot of variety. The bosses can take a shit ton of hits, but that's not really a complaint. I mean, that's just part of the challenge of the game. You really have to know the patterns. It's the kind of game where, I guess it wants to make sure that you're not just getting lucky dodging a few repeats of a pattern. It wants you to do it for a few minutes usually before you beat a boss. So that's cool. It doesn't overdo it. Some games overdo it, like Super Smash TV that I beat for Super Nintendo. Some of those bosses, they take so fucking long to beat. I mean, it just feels like a very, very long fight. It's really overly done with the hit points. But this game is not, it's not like that. It's not to that extreme or anything. Or like Titan mode in God of War 2, where that boss Thesis takes like 15 minutes of shooting arrows at him before he dies. Literally takes 10 or 15 minutes to beat. And you die in like one hit if you get hit by certain attacks. So, I mean, that's fucking bullshit. You know what I mean? But nothing extreme. It's pretty reasonable, I think. You just have to learn the patterns and be able to dance with them for a decent amount of time. It doesn't overstay its welcome for too long, but it does take some time to get all those patterns down. So yeah, this is overall a very solid game. I'd say today it stands up as maybe... I'd probably give it a 7 today, comparing it to, everything that's out there now, including indie games that are similar. It's probably more like a 7. If it was released today as an indie game, I think it would be maybe a 7, a solid 7. It's definitely not refined enough for me to get like an 8 or higher, you know what I mean? It's probably more of like a 7 kind of game. It's just a good game, a good solid game that's pretty good but has flaws. A decent amount of flaws, but it's pretty good. And I would say, rating it back then when it came out, I'd probably still give it a similar rating. I think that sometimes games would deserve a different score depending on when you're rating them, now compared to rating it, 20 years ago. But in this case, there was already so many great games like this, like Gunstar Heroes, that were much better. So I think a 7 is a fair score no matter when you review this game. I think it holds as a solid 7. Thanks for watching.